On Delta Flight 447, a 17-year-old girl named Maya Carson found herself in the midst of a life-threatening situation. As the plane prepared for takeoff, she began struggling to breathe, her chest tightening with every passing second. Maya, who had severe asthma, reached for her inhaler, desperate for relief. But as she trembled in her seat, a flight attendant named Rachel Matthews snatched the inhaler from her hands without hesitation. "That's not real medicine," Rachel declared, holding the inhaler up for all to see, as if Maya's life-saving device was nothing more than a street drug. Maya's heart raced, and her breathing became more labored, but Rachel remained unfazed. She mocked Maya, dismissing her medical bracelet as fake jewelry, and refusing to acknowledge the teen's growing distress. Maya, alone on her journey to attend her grandmother's funeral, tried to explain, but her voice was barely a whisper, as she gasped for air. Rachel's ignorance and racial prejudice were glaringly obvious, as she made assumptions, based solely on Maya's appearance, an assumption that would soon spark outrage. What began as a medical emergency quickly became a public spectacle. Passengers recorded the decisive confrontation, and a live stream of the incident began circulating online. Despite Maya's desperate pleas, Rachel was unmoved, her mind fixated on the idea that Maya didn't belong in first class, and that her inhaler was nothing more than a drug. As the situation escalated, the tension in the cabin was palpable, but no one could have predicted the shocking twist that was about to unfold. Rachel Matthews, a flight attendant on Delta Flight 447, not only refused to allow 17-year-old Maya Carson to use her inhaler but also publicly accused her of carrying street drugs. Maya, a teenager with severe asthma, was already struggling to breathe when Rachel confiscated the inhaler, dismissing it as something other than a legitimate medical device. Maya's condition worsened rapidly, and her distress was only exacerbated by Rachel's dismissive behavior. Despite Maya's attempts to explain that she had asthma and needed the Comdedes inhaler to prevent a potentially deadly attack, Rachel ignored her pleas and instead mocked her. Maya's medical ID bracelet, clearly identifying her as a person with asthma, was disregarded by Rachel, who waved it off as fake jewelry and continued to berate her. "Where did you even get this?" Rachel had sneered when Maya tried to use her inhaler, holding it up like a piece of contraband. "Your dealer?" she taunted, making assumptions about Maya's background and her character based purely on appearance. It was an overt display of racial bias and a deep-seated prejudice that Maya had come to recognize far too often in her life. Maya was visibly shaken, her breath shallow and ragged as she struggled to make herself heard over the hum of the engines. She tried once more to explain that she was traveling alone to attend her grandmother's funeral in Los Angeles, but Rachel was unmoved. Save the sob story, Rachel had snapped dismissively. 10 minutes until scheduled departure, she added, her voice dripping with impatience. Despite Maya's worsening condition, Rachel continued to make assumptions based on stereotypes. She saw Maya dressed simply, and without the quote of a polished appearance of her first-class passengers, as someone who did not belong. And, because of this, Maya's life and her needs were disregarded. This was not just an incident of medical negligence, it was an outright act of racial profiling. Rachel had assumed that Maya was a liar, that she didn't deserve the same respect or rights as the other passengers on the flight. Maya's life-threatening condition was ignored in favor of maintaining a stereotype. And it was this bias that nearly cost her everything. Maya was a young black girl, traveling alone, wearing second-hand clothes, and yet she had been admitted to first class, an uncommon sight in a world so often ruled by class and race. As Maya's condition deteriorated, Rachel remained cold and unyielding. Meanwhile, Maya's phone buzzed repeatedly with calls from her father, but she could barely find the strength to answer. The messages from her father, the very person who had raised her with love and care, were filled with concern, but Maya couldn't respond. She was drowning in her own breathlessness, with nothing but the judgmental gaze of Rachel and the uncomfortable silence of the cabin around her. Rachel's complete refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of Maya's medical condition and her assumptions about the young girl's life were rooted in a deeply ingrained prejudice. She had no empathy, no willingness to listen, and no understanding of the gravity of the situation. In her mind, Maya was just another druggie trying to get away with something, and Rachel's instincts were to enforce order by humiliating the teenager. In that moment, Maya's humanity was stripped away. She was no longer seen as a person with a legitimate medical need, but as an inconvenience, a nuisance, and a stereotype that Rachel felt compelled to dismiss. Maya was fighting for her life, but Rachel was too entrenched in her own worldview to see it. The situation escalated as other passengers, who were witnessing the unfolding events, began to record the confrontation. Tina Rodriguez, a passenger seated nearby, went live on Instagram, documenting the discrimination for the world to see. In a world increasingly driven by social media, the incident was quickly broadcast to thousands of viewers, and the injustice became apparent to anyone watching. The more Rachel dismissed Maya's cries for help, the more people were horrified by what they were witnessing. As the viral video gained traction, it was clear that this was no longer just an issue of medical negligence. It was a stark example of racial discrimination in action. Maya's life was hanging in the balance, yet the people who were supposed to protect her, Rachel, and the other flight attendants, stood by, indifferent to her suffering. The passengers who were recording the live stream had a front-row seat to witness this blatant abuse of power. This incident also brought to light the wider issue of how people of color, particularly black individuals, are often subjected to suspicion and discrimination, even in moments where their lives are at risk. The way Rachel treated Maya was not just a single act of cruelty, it was part of a larger, systemic issue of racial inequality. In her eyes, Maya was a threat, a figure to be controlled, and not a person in need of compassion. This mindset, born out of stereotypes and racial prejudice, is one that has plagued societies for generations. As Maya continued to struggle for air, the tension in the cabin mounted. The weight of Rachel's bias hung heavily in the air, suffocating Maya just as much as her asthma attack. While Maya fought for her life, Rachel's refusal to listen, to understand, and to act with compassion made it clear that the battle she was facing was not just about surviving her asthma attack. It was about surviving a world where people like Maya are constantly fighting, not just for their lives, but for their dignity. This moment on Delta Flight 447 was a powerful reminder of how easily lives can be devalued due to preconceived notions, and how essential it is to challenge these biases before they lead to irreversible harm. As Maya's breathing became increasingly labored, the situation on Delta Flight 447 took an unexpected turn when Tina Rodriguez, a fellow passenger, decided to take action. Seated just a few rows behind Maya, Tina had been quietly observing the disturbing scene unfold. She saw Maya, a young black girl, struggling to breathe, pleading for her inhaler, while the flight attendant, Rachel Matthews, relentlessly accused her of carrying street drugs instead of life-saving medication. Maya's pleas fell on deaf ears, but Tina knew that something had to be done. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Tina quickly pulled out her phone and began streaming the entire confrontation live on Instagram. At first, she thought it might just be a small act of documenting the incident for her followers, but as she recorded Rachel's dismissive attitude, the sharp contrast between Maya's distress and the flight attendant's cold indifference became undeniable. Tina's stream, initially watched by just a few dozen people, rapidly gained traction as more passengers, and then social media users, tuned in. The hashtag #LetMayaBreathe was born within minutes, and people began to flood the comments section, expressing outrage at what they were witnessing. The situation in the cabin had gone from tense to surreal. Maya, still gasping for air, was struggling to keep her composure. The fact that her life-saving inhaler was still out of reach, held by Rachel, who seemed more focused on her authority and protocol than on the teenage girl's medical emergency, was not just distressing, but heart-wrenching. In the first class section of the plane, some passengers began to whisper to one another, while others kept their eyes glued to their phones. Many were watching Tina's live stream, which had now gone viral, as more and more viewers tuned in to see the injustice that was unfolding before them. Within minutes, the number of viewers on Tina's stream skyrocketed. What had initially seemed like an isolated incident on a flight was now taking on a life of its own. People from all over the world were commenting, sharing, and expressing their outrage. It wasn't just a story of a teenager denied access to her medication. It was a story of racial discrimination, medical neglect, and the systemic prejudice that so often goes unchecked in everyday interactions. The power of social media became evident as the stream continued to gain momentum. On the ground, people were already starting to mobilize. Celebrities, activists, and ordinary individuals began to share the live stream, demanding that Delta Airlines and the flight crew take immediate action. The hashtag #LetMayaBreathe quickly gained national attention, with news outlets like CNN, Fox News, and NBC picking up the story in real time. Meanwhile, back on the flight, the situation continued to escalate. Passengers were growing, increasingly uncomfortable, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. Some passengers had already started to pull out their own phones, recording the confrontation from different angles, while others whispered their concerns to one another. The discomfort in the cabin was palpable, as passengers realized that what they were witnessing wasn't just an argument over a medical device, it was an abuse of power, a refusal to acknowledge Maya's humanity. Despite Rachel's attempts to remain in control, the passengers in first class were beginning to question her authority. The realization that the situation was being broadcast to thousands of people made it impossible for Rachel to ignore the mounting pressure. Yet, she continued to stand firm in her decision, unwilling to admit her mistake. It wasn't until Tina's live stream had surpassed 50,000 viewers that the gravity of the situation finally began to sink in, even for the flight attendants who had remained silent until then. The live stream had become a catalyst for a larger movement. People who had previously been unaware of such incidents were now fully invested in Maya's story. The comments section was filled with expressions of support for Maya, with many users calling for accountability and justice. It was no longer just about a girl needing her inhaler, it had become a broader commentary on the way society treats marginalized communities, particularly Black individuals, and how racial profiling continues to shape interactions in public spaces. As the situation unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a reflection of the larger societal issues that many people face every day, but rarely have a platform to expose. Maya's distress was no longer just a personal emergency, it had become a symbol of the fight against prejudice and the importance of standing up for what is right. By the time Tina's live stream had reached 100,000 viewers, it was clear that this incident had transcended the confines of the aircraft. What was happening on Delta Flight 447 had captured the nation's attention, and soon, the world's point Faye. The incident went viral in a way that few could have predicted. Maya's battle for her inhaler had become a rallying cry for those who had long felt the sting of discrimination, as well as for those who were simply tired of seeing injustice go unchecked. News outlets quickly began covering the story, interviewing passengers who had witnessed the ordeal, as well as medical professionals who weighed in on the seriousness of Maya's condition. Social media users, now aware of the viral live stream, began sharing their own stories of discrimination and prejudice. The hashtag number Let Maya Breathe continued to trend for hours, and Maya's name became synonymous with the fight for racial justice, medical rights, and the accountability that the public was demanding from corporations and institutions. Tina Rodriguez, the seemingly ordinary passenger who had just wanted to document an injustice, had unwittingly become an agent of change. She had captured a moment in time that would forever alter the trajectory of Maya's life and, in turn, the lives of countless others. Through her live stream, she had sparked a conversation that transcended the boundaries of flight attendants, passengers, and social media. This was a moment when people saw the very real impact of their voices, and how one small action could amplify the fight for justice in the most unexpected ways. Maya's struggle for her inhaler had become a pivotal moment in the fight against racial and medical discrimination, and it was all made possible by a single act of defiance from a passenger who refused to let the truth go unnoticed. As Maya's struggle to breathe continued to intensify, the tension in the cabin of Delta Flight 447 reached its peak. Despite the growing discomfort of the passengers and the worsening state of Maya's health, the flight attendant, Rachel Matthews, remained unmoved. Her refusal to return Maya's inhaler had caused a rift in the atmosphere, as the passengers grew more aware of the gravity of the situation. It was at this critical moment that a retired doctor, seated a few rows behind Maya, decided to intervene. Dr. Henry Chen, an experienced physician with over 40 years in the medical field, stood up and walked toward the flight attendant section. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "That young lady is showing signs of severe respiratory distress. She needs immediate medical attention and her medication right now." His words were clear, but Rachel was dismissive, shaking her head as she glared at Dr. Chen. "Stay seated, sir," she snapped. "This is a crew matter." The dismissiveness in her voice only heightened the tension in the cabin, and passengers who had been silently watching now began to murmur amongst themselves. Dr. Chen, however, was not deterred. He had seen the signs of a severe asthma attack before, And it was impossible to ignore the struggle in Maya's face. "Ma'am, I'm a licensed physician, and I'm telling you, that girl needs her medication right now," Dr. Chen insisted, his voice unwavering. The urgency in his tone caught the attention of other passengers, but Rachel continued to reject his authority, brushing him off as if his medical expertise meant nothing in comparison to her protocol. As Maya's breathing grew more erratic, her chest rising and falling in a way that was becoming alarming to everyone around her, it was clear that something had to be done. It wasn't just a matter of a medication being withheld, it was a matter of life and death. But Rachel's rigid stance refused to give way. Maya, growing weaker by the second, felt as if the world was closing in around her. Her vision blurred, and her body became drenched in sweat despite the cool cabin temperature. She could feel her life slipping away, but all she could do was try to make her voice heard. Through labored breaths, she whispered, "I need my inhaler, please." Her words were barely audible, but the desperation in her eyes was unmistakable. Still, Rachel refused to acknowledge the urgency of the situation. It wasn't until Maya's phone buzzed again, the same number flashing across the screen, that the next shift in the story began to unfold. Maya, her hand trembling as she reached for the phone, finally answered. "Dad. They won't let me use my inhaler," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper as she struggled to speak. Through the pain, on the other end of the line, Captain Marcus Thompson, a Delta Airlines executive and Maya's father, was immediately alarmed. His daughter's words were laced with panic, and the unmistakable sound of distress in her voice told him that something was terribly wrong. Without hesitation, Marcus Thompson's military-grade professionalism kicked in. "Maya, listen to me. I'm going to fix this, okay? Stay calm." With a deep breath, Marcus shifted into action. He dialed the number for Delta's internal communications, knowing that it would connect him directly to the operations team. He explained the dire situation, and within moments, he had the contact information for the flight crew. Marcus immediately called the flight. As the phone rang, he steeled himself for what was coming next. When Rachel answered the call, her tone was casual, dismissive even. "This is Rachel Matthews," she said, assuming she was speaking to yet another concerned family member. "How may I assist you?" "Rachel, this is Captain Marcus Thompson," came the commanding voice on the other end of the line. "I'm the chief of flight operations for Delta Airlines. I'm calling about my daughter, Maya Thompson, who is currently aboard Flight 447. I understand you're withholding her inhaler. You will return it to her immediately." The change in Rachel's demeanor was instant and palpable. The tone of authority in Marcus's voice left no room for argument. She had been caught in her own actions, and the weight of her mistake began to settle in. "Sir, she began, but her words faltered. "You're currently violating federal regulations, Rachel," Marcus continued, his voice firm but not angry. "You are denying my daughter access to prescribed medication. You are jeopardizing her safety, and you will return the inhaler to her now. This is non-negotiable." Rachel's face turned pale. She had made a grave error, one that was now being exposed for everyone on the flight and soon the world to see. She had underestimated the situation, but now, facing Maya's father, who held immense power within the airline, it was clear that she had no leg to stand on. I didn't know," Rachel stammered, trying to defend herself, but it was too late. "You didn't know because you didn't ask. You assumed, and that assumption nearly cost my daughter her life," Marcus said, his voice cold but controlled. "You will immediately return her inhaler to her, and I will be reporting this incident to the highest levels of the company. Understand that this will be dealt with appropriately." It wasn't long before Rachel, visibly shaken, handed the inhaler back to Maya. As Maya clutched the medication in her hands, her breathing began to normalize, and the color slowly returned to her face. She took a slow, steady breath, grateful for the small but critical relief she had just received. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Rachel's actions would soon lead to much more than a simple reprimand. Marcus, who had remained calm throughout the ordeal, knew that this was far from over. The violation of his daughter's rights, combined with the racial profiling that had driven Rachel's actions, would not go unaddressed. As Rachel handed Maya the inhaler, the passengers around her slowly began to realize the magnitude of what had just occurred. Maya, still shaken, but now able to breathe again, looked up at her father's voice on the phone with a newfound sense of strength. But the wheels of accountability were already in motion. Captain Marcus Thompson's involvement had not only saved his daughter but had also exposed a systematic failure within the airline. The consequences of Rachel's actions would be far-reaching. As Maya's condition gradually stabilized, the tension that had gripped the cabin of Delta Flight 447 began to subside. The moment she was finally handed her inhaler, Maya wasted no time using the medication to ease her labored breathing. Each slow, deliberate breath felt like a lifeline, and within moments, the signs of her asthma attack began to subside. Her chest, which had felt as if it was closing in, slowly expanded, and the color returned to her pale face. The relief was palpable, but the damage caused by the confrontation would not fade so easily. Maya clutched the inhaler tightly, her fingers still trembling from the ordeal, but a sense of control returned to her. She knew the worst had passed, yet the events she had just lived through would stay with her forever. The humiliation, the fear, and the terror of almost losing her life, all because of one flight attendant's refusal to believe her. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin was electric with disbelief and whispers. Passengers who had been recording the entire ordeal on their phones began to exchange glances, their expressions a mix of relief and disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Many of them had expected the airline to act quickly to resolve the situation, but the fact that it took so long for Maya to receive the medication she desperately needed was a stark reminder of the systemic issues that were at play. For some, the anger was not only directed at the flight attendants' actions, but also at the company that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Back on the ground, Marcus Thompson, Maya's father, knew that this incident could now simply be brushed aside. His daughter's life had been threatened by an airline employee's ignorance and prejudice, and he was determined to hold the airline accountable. In his role as Chief of Flight Operations for Delta, Marcus had the leverage to escalate the issue to the highest levels of the company. The internal investigation into the matter was swift, and Delta Airlines, unable to ignore the public outcry and viral attention the incident had garnered, took immediate action. Rachel Matthews, the flight attendant who had refused to allow Maya to use her inhaler, was relieved of her duties effective immediately. Her dismissal came as no surprise to anyone else, the flight who had witnessed her behavior, but the decision was still a moment of justice. Rachel's actions had not only endangered Maya's life, but had also perpetuated the kind of racial profiling and medical negligence that had no place in the airline industry. Delta Airlines could no longer afford to ignore the severity of what had occurred. Beyond her termination, Rachel would also face legal consequences for her actions. The violation of Maya's rights, both under federal law and the company's own policies, had far-reaching implications. Maya's ordeal would be the subject of an internal investigation at Delta, and Rachel's discriminatory actions would likely lead to a legal battle with the airline, and Rachel herself facing scrutiny from the public and the courts. The ramifications of her prejudice and inability to acknowledge her mistake would be felt far beyond the confines of that plane. For Maya, the aftermath of the incident was a mixed bag. On the one hand, she was grateful to have her health restored, and for the support she received from her father and the passengers who had rallied around her. However, the emotional toll of the experience was immense. The discrimination she had faced, coupled with the traumatic nature of the encounter, left scars that would take time to heal. Maya would later become a powerful voice in the movement for racial justice, using her experience to advocate for changes in airline policies and to highlight the dangers of racial profiling. Delta, for its part, acted quickly to amend its policies in the wake of the incident. The airline began implementing new training for its staff to recognize and respect medical devices and conditions, and they introduced better systems for passengers to register their medical needs prior to boarding. In addition, Delta promised to review and improve its procedures for handling medical emergencies, ensuring that flight attendants would be better equipped to handle situations like the one Maya had endured. Despite the swift actions taken by the airline, it was clear that the fight for justice was far from over. The public's response to the incident underscored the power of social media and the importance of holding companies accountable for their actions. What started as a single injustice against one young girl had snowballed into a movement that would impact not just Delta Airlines, but the entire aviation industry. For Maya, the victory was bittersweet. While she had received justice in the form of her medication, Rachel's termination, and the subsequent policy changes at Delta, the experience had opened her eyes to the broader systemic issues that were pervasive in society. Maya knew that her fight wasn't over, it had just begun. Through her bravery in the face of discrimination, Maya had become an unwilling symbol of the struggle for equality and fairness. Her journey was just starting, and she was determined to make sure that what happened to her would never happen again to anyone else. The story of Maya Thompson's harrowing experience on Delta Flight 447 quickly became a turning point in the ongoing fight for civil rights, personal responsibility, and corporate accountability. What began as an isolated incident of medical neglect and racial profiling escalated into a nationwide conversation about the treatment of marginalized communities, particularly Black individuals, and the importance of upholding human dignity in every sector, especially in public spaces like airports and airplanes. Maya's distress, broadcast to millions through social media, exposed the pervasive nature of prejudice and discrimination that too often goes unnoticed, sparking a wave of change across industries. In the wake of the incident, Delta Airlines took swift action to address the shortcomings that had allowed such an event to occur. The airline not only dismissed the flight attendant responsible for the discriminatory actions, but also committed to overhauling its internal policies. Delta implemented comprehensive new training for all staff members, emphasizing the importance of recognizing medical devices, understanding the needs of passengers with medical conditions, and responding to emergencies with compassion and urgency. These new policies were designed to ensure that passengers would no longer be subjected to the kind of mistreatment that Maya endured, regardless of their background or appearance. Delta's swift response sent a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated, but the impact didn't stop there. The lessons learned from Maya's experience resonated throughout the airline industry. Several major carriers followed suit, adopting similar policies regarding the recognition of medical conditions and devices, with a focus on preventing racial profiling and ensuring equitable treatment for all passengers. The ripple effect of Maya's story prompted changes not just within Delta but across the broader aviation landscape, signaling a significant shift toward more inclusive and respectful treatment of travelers. The consequences of Maya's ordeal extended far beyond the airline industry. Her story became a rallying cry for those fighting against racial injustice, medical discrimination, and the failure of institutions to protect the vulnerable. It sparked discussions in schools, communities, and workplaces about the importance of standing up for what is right, even when faced with adversity. Maya's courage in the face of overwhelming odds turned her into a lafe, a symbol of strength and resilience, inspiring countless individuals to demand better treatment and accountability from both corporations and society as a whole. As Maya's case continued to gain traction, she was invited to speak before congressional subcommittees and civil rights organizations, becoming a voice for those who had been historically silenced. Her testimony helped fuel legislative efforts to ensure that policies protecting individuals with medical conditions would be more rigorously enforced. Furthermore, Maya's experience underscored the power of social media as a tool for holding institutions accountable, showing how quickly injustices could be exposed and addressed when the public came together to support a cause. In the months and years that followed, Maya's story became more than just a viral moment. It became a catalyst for systemic change. Delta's new policies became a model for other industries, while Maya's personal growth and activism led to even greater opportunities to advocate for marginalized voices. Through her resilience and the public support she garnered, Maya helped create a future where others wouldn't have to endure the same kind of discrimination she faced. The transformation that took place in the wake of her story was a testament to the power of individual courage, public outcry, and the pursuit of justice. Maya Thompson's ordeal on Delta Flight 447 not only transformed her life but also sparked long-lasting changes in the aviation industry and beyond. Her courage in the face of blatant racial discrimination and medical neglect turned her into a symbol of justice, making her an influential advocate for the rights of marginalized communities and passengers with medical conditions. What began as a deeply personal struggle for her own health quickly evolved into a larger movement for change, as Maya used her voice to address systemic injustices that affected countless others. As her story gained national attention, Maya became an unexpected spokesperson for passenger rights. Her bravery inspired people around the world to stand up against discrimination, and she used her platform to call for greater accountability from airlines and other institutions. She was invited to speak at conferences, rallies, and civil rights events, where her advocacy for the fair treatment of passengers and individuals with medical conditions resonated deeply. Her passion for equality and her personal experience of being unjustly targeted by a flight attendant, helped to shed light on the broader issues of racial profiling and medical discrimination in the airline industry. In the wake of her public fight, Maya worked closely with lawmakers and civil rights organizations to push for policy changes that would protect the rights of people traveling with medical conditions. She helped spearhead efforts to create more robust protections for passengers who rely on medical devices, ensuring that their needs would be prioritized and respected by airline staff. Maya's advocacy led to the creation of clearer guidelines for flight attendants and other airline personnel regarding the handling of medical emergencies, including better training on recognizing medical devices and understanding the needs of passengers with conditions like asthma, diabetes, and other chronic illnesses. Her work didn't stop with the airline industry. Maya's fight for justice also helped to raise awareness about the challenges faced by marginalized communities in other areas, from healthcare to education. By sharing her story and pushing for legislative change, she highlighted how deeply systemic issues of bias and prejudice could be ingrained in everyday experiences. Maya's work helped lay the foundation for broader reforms that aim to ensure that people of all backgrounds, races, and medical needs would be treated with dignity and respect. The impact of Maya's story was also felt internationally. Airlines from around the world began to adopt similar medical accommodation policies, and the conversation about race, healthcare, and equality took center stage in the public discourse. Her example of using adversity to fuel systemic change inspired countless others to take action in their own communities, fostering a global movement for justice and inclusion. Maya's courage and resilience became a touchstone for future generations, reminding them that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person's actions could create lasting change. Her journey from a frightened teenager fighting for her life to a powerful advocate for the rights of others showed the world the true strength of the human spirit and the impact of U60s. Standing up for what is right. Maya's legacy is one of empowerment, justice, and a relentless pursuit of a world where every individual's dignity is upheld, no matter their race, background, or medical need. Maya Thompson's story is a powerful reminder that individual actions can spark monumental change. In a world where prejudice and discrimination often go unchecked, her willingness to stand up for herself in the face of medical neglect and racial bias not only saved her life, but also ignited a movement that reshaped the airline industry. Maya's courage became a beacon of hope for countless others who have felt powerless against systemic injustices. She chose not to remain silent when faced with adversity, and through her bravery, she demonstrated how one person's voice can ripple outward, touching lives and inspiring widespread reform. The message here is simple yet profound. When we witness injustice, we can either remain silent or take action. Maya chose the latter, and in doing so, she showed us that the fight for equality begins with the courage to speak out, the willingness to document the truth, and the resolve to demand change. Her story proves that no matter how small we may feel, our actions can reverberate far beyond what we could ever imagine. Never underestimate the power of standing up for what's right, no matter the size of the fight. Your voice, your story, and your actions can create a ripple effect that leads to real change. Maya's story encourages us to always act with integrity and to never be afraid to challenge injustice, no matter where we see it. If you've been inspired by Maya's journey, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and share your own experiences with injustice. Don't forget to like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, change, and hope. Let's keep spreading the message of accountability and empowerment.